Hi everyone to our presentation on grocery store botany. My name is Christine Gillard and I am here with Todd Boland. We are from Munn Botanical Garden. I'm an environmental educator and this is part of our Biology 2010 program. Todd is our horticulturalist, so he will give you lots of information about the botany of the plants that we're talking about that you would find in a grocery store today. So one of the things you'll notice in this show here is I have some rough pictures of our presentation. And in our presentation, this was an in-person lab where we got everyone together and we showed you foods that we would find in a grocery store, that we'd find in our own homes, and we would actually snack on some of them. And I apologize for some of these rough pictures. I kind of wanted to show you what our setup was like, but it's going to go over the roots of the different parts of the plants, and the beginning one is the roots. So I'll let Todd talk about that.
All right, thanks, Christine. So most people, of course, we all know the purpose of roots. You know, it's the whole idea is to anchor the plant into place, to absorb water and nutrients for the plant as well. But in some cases, there are plants that produce edible roots. One thing to keep in mind, though, when you're thinking about edible rooted plants, is that plants themselves have two main root systems. They either have a fibrous root system or they'll have a taproot system. And in the case of plants that we eat the roots, those are always plants that have a taproot system. Okay, so there are no fibrous rooted plants that we will eat the roots on. So here in front of us now on the screen, you will see typical commonly available root vegetables that we can purchase in our local supermarkets. On the right, we have our carrot. And on the top left are beets, and then on the lower portion there are turnips. So those are all plants that we eat the roots, and they're all plants that produce a taproot.
Okay. In this next photo, I just wanted to show everyone how back in our original photo of the table, I had purchased at our grocery store some of these kettle uprooted chips, and it's always fun to eat them. But here are some that were roots that we can get that are great snacks, just like our sweet potato there. So our next section is stems, and you don't often think about eating stems, I feel, as much, but there's actually some key ones here that we will be eating, so Todd will talk about.
Okay, so probably the most important plant in the world, in the big scheme of things, certainly in a lot of developing countries, is sugarcane. And of course, with sugarcane, that is our source for sugar. And we all are eating sugar way too much, it seems, these days. But anyways, it's hard to find a food product out there that doesn't have sugar if it's a refined one. So what they'll do in a lot of these tropical countries, they'll harvest the canes from the sugar cane, which is a type of grass, and they will extract the sap from the canes of the sugarcane plant. And from that sap, then they extract the sugar that we purchase. Now, sometimes you'll get sugar that's brown sugar and sugar that's white. So the less refined the sugar is, the darker it will be in color. Okay, so brown sugar is not as refined as golden, which is not as refined as white. So white sugar itself is the most refined. Now, another product we don't think about so much as being from the stem is maple syrup. Okay, so what we do here, Canada is the biggest producer in the world of maple syrup, and we're taking advantage of the spring uptake of water by the roots of maple trees, certain maple trees in particular, the sugar maple, but some other maples also produce maple syrup as well, sorry. So in the spring of the year, we tap the sap that's running up into the trees, getting ready for the bud break later on in the spring. And when we boil down that sap, we will concentrate the sugars into it until we reach a stage where it becomes a syrup. And that's what we have then as the maple syrup.
So maple syrup is actually something I've produced myself. Now, having grown up in Southern Ontario, there were many sugar bushes, they're called, where they produce the sugar maple tree that has the highest density of sugar in its sap, and that's the one that makes the most money off of it. I just assumed that was the only tree we could get maple syrup from, and it wasn't until some local people here were telling everyone that no, you can tap any sort of maple tree, whether it be our Norway maples, which grow like weeds through the cracks in the sidewalks downtown everywhere, or any other type of maple you have on your property, as well as birch. You can also do birch syrup. So I have some silver maples and some Norway maples alongside my driveway. And I've been tapping them every year now for about 4 or 5 years. And I tapped only 2 trees in 2019, and I still have syrup from that time, from the 2 that I tapped. So you can produce quite a lot. I mean, it depends how much each person eats, but I've taken 2 years to get through the amount that I had done in 2019. So it's something fun you can do, and there will be some links maybe on our website about that.
All right. You have yet to bring some of that syrup in for me to try, Christine. There's a
Will
little
do.
hint, nudge, nudge there. Okay. So another popular vegetable that we can purchase is asparagus. So in the case of asparagus, we're eating the young stems, or what we call the shoots, as they emerge in the spring of the year. Now, if you left your asparagus to grow longer, it eventually reach to 6 to 8 feet in height, and then the stems become very tough and woody. But when they first emerge in the spring of the year, they're still soft and supple and tender, and that is the stage then we will go ahead and harvest those and eat them.
Asparagus is actually something that grows well in our climate that we don't often think about growing, but it takes 3 years to be able to get a plant that's large enough that you can start harvesting it to create food for yourself. And so I heard somebody once say that whenever they moved into a new house, they would always plant asparagus, hoping that they were still living there in 3 years to have something to eat, which brings us to one of our plants is going to be in a few slides from now.
All right, now these are weird monstrosities, really, because we don't think of stems as being underground. Okay, we always typically think of stems as being above ground portions of a plant. The whole purpose is to provide support for the plant, and then basically transport nutrients back and forth from the top to the bottom of the plant. But in certain plants, they actually produce underground stems. So what you see in the top part of the screen here is a ginger root. Okay, so a ginger root is basically what we call a rhizome. It's an underground stem, and what you'll see on the ginger root are these little bumps that are along the side. And those are, if you planted it in the ground, those are where new shoots would develop. Okay, so new above ground shoots would form, and then the lower portion would develop into the actual roots. Okay, so in this case, the ginger root is an underground stem. Now in the lower picture, we have potato. Now we always think of potato, we call it a tuber. And a tuber is actually a specialized type of root for most plants, but in the case of a potato tuber, it's actually a specialized underground stem as well. So what you're seeing on a potato are what we call the eyes of a potato, and those eyes of the potato, if you planted it in the ground, that is where new shoots would develop, and then roots would come from the base of those shoots, okay? So in this case, a potato is basically a storage organ for the plant, allows it to survive through periods of inactivity, we'll say, basically winter here in Newfoundland. But potato, as much as we think of it as being a root, is actually a specialized form of stem.
So our next section is leaves, and I feel like it's not hard for us to think about eating leaves. There's some pretty common ones that Todd will talk about here.
All right, so when you're going to your supermarket, of course, you know, we'll see lots of different types of cabbages, lots of different types of lettuce. Spinach is another very popular vegetable where we typically will eat the leaves from. But as Christine mentioned, there are some other more unusual plants out there that have that we purchase the leaves or eat the leaves, sorry. So here in this picture here on the left-hand side of the screen is rhubarb. Okay, now a lot of Newfoundlanders, of course, will have rhubarb growing in their gardens. It's a very easy plant for us to grow. And we think of the stalks on a rhubarb, and then on the right are the stalks from celery. And we think of those as being stems, okay? But in actual fact, these are not stems. These are the petiole of a leaf, okay? So if you think back to the botany of a leaf is composed of 2 portions. You have the flat green blade, which is responsible for photosynthesis, and then we have the petiole, or the leaf stalk or leaf stem, that attaches the blade to the main stem of a plant, okay? So when we're eating our rhubarb stalks or we're eating the stalks on a celery, we're actually eating the petiole of a leaf. Now, in the case of celery, you can eat the leaves as well. People sometimes throw the leaves into soups. In the case of rhubarb, however, the leaves are actually quite toxic. So you had to make sure you're only eating the stalk, which is perfectly fine, and not be eating the green portion.
So you mentioned spinach as well, and I feel like we wouldn't question that with eating the petiole on the spinach as being part of the leaf because it's often in our salad, right? The whole leaf and the
Yep.
petiole is part of our salad.
And
Um,
the same idea with the Swiss chard.
yeah,
And Swiss chard, again, sometimes you can get those with the red stems. They look almost like rhubarb. I think they call them rhubarb chard. And in that case, when you're cooking your chard, you're cooking both the leaves and the stems.
yep. And earlier I was mentioning about asparagus and it taking 3 years to grow. Rhubarb is another one of those ones. And
Yes.
I've been super fortunate that when I was renting and even when I moved into my current house, the people before us had rhubarb. And I feel it's such a common vegetable to have around in Newfoundland because it's part of our many dishes. But you want to plant it, you want to give it some time, you give it a few years, and once you've got it, you've got it. It's a perennial plant and it can add a lot of delicious pies and stews and different things you can add it to. Okay.
All right, now here's another unusual scenario. We have an onion. Okay, an onion is a type of bulb. Okay, and a bulb is another specialized storage organ for a number of plants. And again, it helps the plants survive through periods of dormancy for the plant, which could be the winter, or in the case of a really hot climate, it could be during the dry season. So what's unusual about a bulb, in this case with the onions, what you're eating is not a root, is not a stem, it's actually modified leaves, okay? So each one of those rings that you see on an onion, if you cut it longitudinally, are actually modified leaves that are used for storage of the plant during its dormant season. So it's a little bit unusual. We don't think of it that way, but from a botanical point of view, bulbs themselves are all developed from modified leaves.
So I showed in our original picture on our table that we actually had a setup to sample some tea. And one of the teas that we had is this oolong tea. Now, if you've watched Todd's previous presentation on coffee, tea, and cocoa, he does go into a little bit of the background of using tea. This oolong tea is a tea that we would get out of China. And I think it just added an interest because it's served as the balled up leaf. And as you add water onto it, the leaf actually unfurls. And you really get that feeling that you're drinking from leaves, but any tea that you have is leaves, right? Like, I mean, we know that from the presentation, but your tea leaves are just chopped up small and put into your tea bag so that you can get the most surface area and get the most flavor out of the leaves. Whereas in this case, they're often served full. Many of our foods that we did eat in this lab or drank in this lab like this one, were purchased at a store downtown, downtown St. John's. That's called Food for Thought. And they serve a lot of interesting things that you wouldn't find maybe at your grocery store, things that are organic and you can buy them in bulk. It's a really good store to support, and I'll talk about them again at the end of the presentation. So our next section here is flowers. And again, you can see there's tea on the table. So I think we had some jasmine tea maybe to drink, but there's a few different flowers. Flowers are not really the food that we often think of eating as part of our dish, but there is a few different ones that are pretty common.
Okay, so I guess the most popular flowers that we actually eat from the grocery stores will be broccoli, which are the green on the top left, and cauliflower, okay? So in that case here, we're eating the unopened flower buds from the plant.
And one of the things I always notice and like to point out to younger people when we're showing a bit of botany is in your broccoli, if the broccoli starts to look a bit yellow, it's not that it's going bad, it's that those leaf buds, or their flower buds, are opening. And you're starting to see the yellow flower. And that's just the plant maturing. It's not as tasty, of course, to us at that point.
Okay, so now this is a different scenario. So in the case, well, so in the case of the broccoli and the cauliflower, we're actually physically eating the flower buds. In this case, these are capers, and capers is a tropical plant. And in this case, we actually harvest the unopened flower buds, and those are pickled to create capers.
Sorry.
And in other plants, okay, all right. So capers themselves are popular in Italian cooking. Most people either have a love-hate relationship with them. You either really like them or you really, really hate them. I fall into that latter category myself.
I almost feel like they're quite salty. And so they add a flavor to a dish that's often similar to adding other salty foods like feta cheese or something.
Exactly. Okay, so in this case here now, on the left side, we have a nasturtium plant. And with nasturtiums, you can actually eat the flowers. You can actually eat the leaves as well. They're very, very hot and spicy and very peppery in taste. So you wouldn't want to use them very much. Put them into a salad, but do it very sparingly. On the lower right, what you see, all this sort of yellowy, orangey color that's there, are the stamens from a type of crocus, or stigmas, sorry, stigmas from a particular crocus called the saffron crocus. So that is basically harvested from the crocuses and dried to create saffron, which is very, very popular in a lot of sort of North African type of cuisine.
It's often used to give kind of like a color to rice, I find as well. But saffron, I think, I'm not sure the exact stat on it, but it's one of the most expensive foods by its weight. So I did look into buying it locally, and I think I could buy something that was probably like half a gram for $20 or $40 or something like that. It's a pretty tiny amount, but it's pretty popular in certain cuisines.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to dye your rice, use turmeric. It's
Yeah.
a lot cheaper.
So, of course, fruit I feel is the most obvious botanical discussion that we have, picking out saying this is a fruit, because fruit is also used as a culinary term. And this is where we get a lot of people having confusion, because they say, well, isn't that a vegetable? Isn't tomato a vegetable? And I have to explain, well, the word vegetable is a culinary term. It's something we use when we're cooking and talking about food. It's not a botanical term. And so fruit is the botanical description of this is something that is an ovary with seeds inside of it. So of course a tomato has seeds inside of it, and so it makes it a fruit, and all of these will have seeds inside of them.
Okay, so once you get into your class and you talk about different types of fruit, you'll discover there's lots of different types of fruit amongst plants. Some have what we call a fleshy fruit. So those are ones where we typically would consume most of the fruit. The seeds themselves in the wild would just sort of pass out through the gut after the fact. In our case, we'll just sort of spit out the seeds. But wild animals oftentimes would eat the seeds that are within the fleshy fruit. And then as they're traveling around and defecating, they would help to spread the seeds around then. So on the left-hand side here, we have an apple. And an apple is a specialized form of fleshy fruit called a pome, P-O-M-E. And a pome has an inner chamber, and the seeds themselves are located within the inner chamber, and the nest surrounded by the fleshy portion of the fruit. On the right-hand side, we have cherries. And if you ever have you eaten a cherry, you'll notice it's only got a single seed or a pit in the middle. So that is what we botanically call a drupe. Okay, so plums, peaches would also fall into that category of being a drupe. It's a fleshy fruit with just a single central seed. Okay, so on the screen here now, we have samples or different examples of berries. Okay, so on the upper right-hand side, we have blueberries. Most of us will recognize those. We have no problem calling that a berry. Grapes, on the other hand, we might sort of question, is that a berry? It seems a bit odd for a berry. And then, of course, we have tomatoes. But botanically speaking, a berry is simply a fleshy fruit that has seeds scattered throughout the flesh. Okay, so typically when we're eating a berry, we eat the fleshy portion and the seeds at the same time. Now, if the seeds are a little bit large, like some of the seeded grapes, we can spit those out. But a lot of times we just sort of swallow the fruit, seeds and all. All right, so here we have now lemons on the left and oranges on the right. And those are what we call a specialized type of fruit called a Hesperidium. A Hesperidium. So you have this waxy coating, a rind, so to speak, on the outside. And then the inside, you have the fleshy portion, which is divided into different sort of quarters or different segments. And then the seeds are located directly in the center of each of those segments. All right, so here now we have pumpkin on the left, and we have cucumbers on the right. And those are another type of specialized fruit called a pepo, P-E-P-O. Zucchini, squashes, they'll fall into that same category as well. So again, you have a thick rind, and then you have a central core of seeds in the center of the fruit. Now we're coming into more strange oddities, we'll say, in the fruit world. So here we have bananas. We're all familiar with bananas. So bananas themselves are a tropical tree, and it's an interesting plant because the plant is sterile. In fact, they have been bred to be triploids, and as triploids, they don't produce viable seed. So if you look very closely at a banana, if you slice it down, you will see what look like little tiny sort of brownish beige colored little spots in the middle of the fruit. Those are the seeds that never developed, okay? So being a triploid, they are sterile, but then of course plants have to be are generally reproduced by seed. Like how in heck are they going to reproduce otherwise? In the case of a banana, they are asexually reproduced. So what happens after a main stalk flowers and produces fruit, it dies, but then you'll get little baby plants developing at the base of the old plant, and then those are separated and grown on to a new plant.
Just a quick little tidbit for those who ever do get a chance to come visit us in our private nursery. So you would have to be on a class to come visit us. We actually do have a banana tree growing and have produced some fruit. Have you gotten a chance to taste it, Todd?
No, just like your maple syrup, which you're hoarding to yourself. When the banana produces fruit in the greenhouse, Tim, our nursery manager, he hoards it for himself. So one of these days, I'll get a chance to eat it. He keeps telling me how wonderful they are, however.
Now, I'm under the impression it's probably half the size or less of the ones you would get from a grocery store. And
oh, yes.
I don't know if he's gotten more than one.
Well, the plants themselves only get to probably about 3 or 4 feet high, and he typically only gets maybe a half a dozen half-sized bananas per plant.
Okay. Someday soon, we'll get to try them. I've never tried one. I don't think any of our visitors would, but we can at least see the tree. That's the fun part. I wanted to just pipe in for a second there before Todd goes into the detail about this. I really wanted to add in the photo of a pineapple, and I showed that even in our lab on the table for people who were coming in person, because now Todd and I have actually both spent time in Costa Rica and have seen pineapples growing. And the first time I saw a pineapple growing, it just totally blew my mind that they grow on a plant on the ground. And it looks like the top of a pineapple that the pineapple is growing on top of, and they just keep layering up like that. And the fun part about it is that if you do have a pineapple at home, if you twist off the top of the pineapple and maybe put a little bit of rooting hormone on the bottom, you can plant that in soil and have it growing as a house plant. And I had a few growing around my house. You had to be careful not to back into them. They're pretty sharp and spiky, but it's kind of a fun house plant to have around and just kind of show off.
All right, so in the case, I put these 2 slides on here to show you some more specialized forms of fruit. So in the case of a pineapple, it's what we call a multiple fruit. The raspberry, on the other hand, is what we call an aggregate fruit. So getting back to the pineapple, it's a multiple fruit. So what you see there, each one of those little bumps that you see on the pineapple is an individual flower. And as the flowers develop their fruit, all the fruits sort of mesh together to form one larger fruit, okay? So basically a pineapple is one solid type of fruit in itself that's composed of many, many smaller fruits that are all combined together to form one larger fruit. In the case of raspberries, they are what we call a aggregate fruit, and from one flower, you actually get multiple fruits developing. Okay, so each one of those little bumps that you see on a raspberry is an individual fruit of itself, and it's actually a drupe. Okay, there's a single seed in the center of each one of those. But you get multiple drupes all joining together to form one larger fruit, which we call the raspberry itself. But in this case, the raspberry blossom actually contains several different ovaries, okay, that produce separate fruits that are sort of loosely joined together. Whereas in the case of a pineapple, it is one or a multiple of individual flowers, not just one flower, but a whole spike of individual flowers whose fruit then join together to form one larger fruit. Okay, here we have another oddball, we'll say, in the fruit department. This is a vanilla orchid, okay? So orchids themselves, orchids are one of the largest plant families in the world, but really they're only important for the most part from a commercial point of view for the actual flowers. There's only one edible orchid in the world, and that's vanilla. And what you're seeing there on the right-hand side are what we call the vanilla pods, okay, or the vanilla beans. And they're called vanilla beans because the pods look like a green bean, okay? But in fact, you're actually harvesting the entire fruit as opposed to just the seeds inside, okay? So when we think about beans, we oftentimes think about the seeds that are within the bean pod, okay? But in this case right here, orchid seeds themselves are like dust. So they actually harvest and dry, and then they have to extract the vanilla flavoring from those dried seed pods, okay? So it's an entire seed pod that you're harvesting on a vanilla.
So keeping in mind that anything that's the entire pod is a fruit. So when we eat what we call a green bean, as in the entire long bean, is a fruit, but then the inside is not. And that's what we're going to get into the next station. But we got a couple
Okay.
minutes.
So here's another product, olive oil, okay? So olive oil itself is actually extracted from the fleshy fruit of, again, what is a drupe, okay? So here you see the olive fruit, and within that fruit, there is a single seed, but the olive oil itself is coming from the fleshy portion of that olive, and the oil then is extracted from the very, very oily, fleshy portion of the fruit.
So yeah, so this next station here is about seeds. And when I often talk to children about botany and ask them for an example of a seed that they ate, they will sometimes say things like sunflower seeds or pumpkin seeds, and then sometimes they'll mention watermelon seeds. And I have to point out to them that we don't usually eat watermelon seeds on purpose. We might by accident every now and then, but some of the most common foods that we're eating every day that we maybe ate for breakfast, a lot of our carbohydrate meals come from seeds. Now we have to be careful that we're talking about just the inside of a seed and not a whole grain. So we'll point that out here.
Okay, so here we have corn. Corn itself produces lots of individual little seeds that are all joined together and attached to what we call the cob. Okay, so the whole cob would be the fruit, but each of the seeds are attached to that central core. We don't eat the core, we are only actually eating the seeds themselves. Now, on the other hand, we have flour, okay? And as Christine mentioned, most of the carbohydrates that we're eating on a regular basis are cereals, breads, pasta, things along those lines are all derived from flour. And the flour is generally coming from a member of the grass family, not always, but in often cases it is. So things like barley, rye, wheat, oats, okay? But in this case, we're only, in the case of a regular flour, we're only extracting the true seed in the center. Unless it's a whole grain flour. If it's a whole grain flour, then you're eating the entire dried fruit that has been ground down and made into flour. Whereas when you're eating non-whole grain flours, it's only from the seed itself. The outer brown portions of the brands, so to speak, most of that has been extracted. Okay, so here we have a field of canola. And if you've ever traveled across the Midwest of North America, you oftentimes see beautiful fields of golden canola. In the case of canola, it's related to your broccoli. So as Christine mentioned, if you leave your broccoli long enough, you get little yellow flowers developing on it. In this case with the canola, we're actually harvesting the seeds. Okay, so you can sort of see that on the right side there. Once the seed pods are ripe, we extract the seeds, and then it's from the crushing of the seeds that we actually extract the canola oil. Now, Christine, this is your baby.
Yeah, so coconuts are something again. I feel that people, if you haven't been to any sort of maybe somewhat warmer tropical areas, Florida or south, that you automatically assume a coconut's brown. And if you look at this picture, up in the tree, the coconuts, they start off green and they mature to a nice kind of orangey yellow color. And by the time they're brown, they actually look pretty rotten and they've fallen off and are onto the ground. But that's just the husk on the outside. And what we would buy in the grocery store, it has had that husk removed. So you can see that in the top left photo with that center core there of that's actually inside the full coconut. So the full piece would be the fruit that we see up in the tree. But when we're actually eating the coconut, we're eating like the center here of the seed. So just that white part is the edible part, of course, of it. Coconuts are infamous for being able to travel long distances because of all of this material, making them lightweight. They float on water and of course can travel on water then around the world and propagate any sort of islands. Okay, next one.
Okay, so here we have peanuts. Okay, so peanuts are an unusual plant because the flowers are actually developed above ground, but as the fruits develop, the flowers actually bury themselves such that the fruit is actually developed underground. So when you go and you buy just like the actual peanuts in the shell, you're actually buying the entire fruit, but you're not eating the entire fruit. You're actually going to break open that husk and only eat the seed that's within the fruit of the peanut plant. And as you recall, when in my presentation on the tea, coffee, and cocoa, when we're drinking our coffee, it's actually coming from the seed, okay? So this is a berry, and the berry contains 2 seeds inside the coffee berry. We take those seeds, we dry them, we roast them, we grind them, and then we get coffee from that. And much in the same way as we do with the cocoa. We extract the seeds from the fruit, and we dry those seeds, roast those seeds, and grind it down to create cocoa powder.
So this last thing that we had for people to sample within our lab is sprouts. So now a sprout would be considered a seed that is now germinated, and it's still considered a sprout before it's at the next stage of being a full-on plant, while it is just the cotyledons, and then you can see these sprouts in the picture have almost like a little tail on them that would be the root, as well as part of the original stem. And where one ends and the next one begins, who really knows? But you're eating that whole thing. You're eating the whole plant at this point. It only is the first set of leaves. It's not what they would call the first set of true leaves. As soon as it develops the next set of leaves, then you're talking about eating. It would be a more full plant. These particular sprouts is something I like to actually do, and I'm hoping to do a video for your propagation lab on how to grow some sprouts at home. It's a super fun and easy thing to do because you can buy these sprouts like in the picture I have on the right. Again, this came from the store downtown St. John's called Food for Thought. You can buy them online, you can buy them various places. You do want to probably keep in mind that you're making sure that the sprouts and the seeds that you're getting are for eating, not for planting. And yeah, you take these seeds and just add a little bit of water and they will germinate and then you can eat them, and they actually open up the ability of having more nutrition once they have germinated. So in our last slide here, we gave the students an opportunity to use any of the knowledge they've just learned and looked at all these different objects and find a place where they fit. It's a little bit fun, and I've put in a few teasers in there. So Todd and I are just going to mention a few of these different ones that may or may not actually fit on some of our tables. So Todd, you pick out one and tell me about it.
Okay, I'm going to start off with the more unusual one, honey.
Ooh, yep.
Okay, so there we go. So here's our honey. Now, we think about honey, of course, is coming from bees. All right, so it's a bee. We think of it as an animal product, I suppose. But in actual fact, of course, bees are gathering the honey or making the honey from gathering the nectar from flowers. So, and the nectar, of course, is very sugary, but the bees themselves will concentrate that sugar almost in a similar way, but sort of like for maple syrup. Okay, so you're concentrating the sugars down to make it the sap into a maple syrup. In this case, they're concentrating the nectar of a flower to create honey. So it still originates from a plant, even though it's been, we'll say, produced or it's a byproduct of an animal. The actual source of the honey is actually coming from a plant.
Now the next one I'm going to pick out, I've got a couple examples here, a tiny little packet and also a bottle of white vinegar. So we wouldn't really think about white vinegar as coming from a plant, but it is actually distilled from grain alcohol. So if we were to take some products like vodka, I think they've mentioned, and they actually add oxygen in it to distill it even further. And then it produces acetic acid. And it's that acetic acid that we use for white vinegar. Now, there are other types of vinegar out there, like apple cider vinegar or red wine vinegar, and both of those two coming from fruits, whereas this one would probably come from, I'm not sure if they would use a whole grain. If they used a whole grain, it's going to fall into the fruit category. If it's just the center of the grain, then it is going to be the seed. You got another one, Todd?
Yeah, okay. So something that most of us, very few of us would not have purchased or consumed at some point is alcohol. Okay, so we're talking about any of these kind of spirits. It could be whiskey, it could be brandy, it could be wine, it could be beer. And essentially all the different types of liquors and liqueurs, these alcoholic drinks that we purchase in the liquor stores are all derived from plant material at some point. Okay, so we think about our wine. Of course, our wines are coming from grapes for the most part, which is the entire fruit. A lot of our brandies are actually created from fruit as well. Other things like your whiskeys are actually coming from the barley for the most part. Beer could be from wheat or from barley. Now, again, with that case, I suspect they're probably just using the actual seed as opposed to the full fruit, unless it's a whole grain that they're using for that. But that's the scenario for those. So think about next time you're consuming alcohol, you are actually consuming plants as well.
And then one last one I'm going to mention there. You'll see front and center is our salt and pepper. Salt is not coming from a plant. That is a mineral. We're eating rocks. And there's a few of those out there. And I'm going to mention a couple of others in a second. But pepper. Pepper comes from a fruit. Again, it's from the peppercorn, and the peppercorn, of course, is ground up, and then it's a dried fruit, and then ground up to make our black pepper that we would shake onto our food. All right, one last thing I just wanted to go over is something kind of fun here that I like to, again, ask people all the time, saying, have you eaten any plants today? And the things that they mention usually are fruits and what we would call vegetables, again. But then they forget about things like this. So our chocolate chip cookie, what kind of plants, what part of the plants are we eating when we're eating a chocolate chip cookie? So we've got our white flour, which is our seeds, right?
Seeds, unless it's whole grain flour.
I don't know. I don't usually use whole wheat flour to make chocolate chip cookies. You could.
Probably could. It might be healthier for you.
It probably would. But then, of course, our white and brown sugar, that brings us back to our sap, which comes from the stem of the plant. Our vanilla, Todd talked about that one, about the fruit of the plant. Now, of course, we're going to have some animal products. Now, thinking about eggs and butter, our chickens and cows, these guys eat plants themselves. So indirectly, these things come from plants. Of course, plants is something we all need to be able to survive. Now, the last three, the baking soda, baking powder, salt, these again go back to these minerals that we're using in our food. Those chocolate chips there, Todd, do you want to mention those ones?
Yeah, okay. So your chocolate chips, of course, big content in that is sugar. But of course, the other important content is chocolate. All right, so you refer back to my coffee, tea, and cocoa. The chocolate is actually the roasted and ground seeds from our cocoa plant. But we also have cocoa butter. And the fruit of a cocoa plant has quite a thick rind, and the cocoa butter itself is extracted from that rind. So you can use cocoa butter both in cooking, but it's also used in cosmetics, okay? So it's important in the perfume industry as well. Then as Christine mentioned, we have milk fat that's coming from the products from our cows, which of course would not be around if they weren't eating the plants. Soy lecithin is coming from the seed of the soy plant. And of course, then we have our natural flavors, which more than likely are going to come from plants as well.
So we have produced a resource manual. I'll just show you a picture there. And I will put links into the description in the bottom of this video below. This From Garden to Classroom was produced a few years back now, 2011 actually. And there's a whole section in here that we actually outline different foods that fall into different categories. And we always challenge everyone if they want to send us a food that you aren't sure what category it fits into. We can add it to our future list for the next time we produce our next version of this book. But it gives us kind of some ideas of different things that we can do and then play and maybe even actually take some of our snacks and grow them. So it's a fun activity book geared towards teachers teaching younger children this in the classroom, but it's something you can for everyone to learn about. So thanks very much for joining us there today. This is just the second of 2 videos there as part of our Botany 2010 lab, and you can visit our website for more information on our events and programs. Thanks.
Thank you much.